and Veterans for Peace, I'd like to welcome you to our program, Towards Nuclear Disarmament, U.S. Nuclear Posture Review. This is a timely and pertinent issue in light of the U.S. nuclear buildup and our country's seeming rush to war. Veterans for Peace has been one of our country's most important voices, articulating the human cost of war and advocating against it. It's my honor to introduce Nate Goldschlag, moderator and chief organizer of today's program. Nate is a longtime activist since getting kicked out of Harvard for occupying University Hall in 1969. He's a past board member of Veterans for Peace and National Treasurer for 3 years. He is currently the coordinator of Chapter 9 of VFP, the Smedley Butler Brigade. Nate, thank you.
Thanks, Susan. It's my pleasure to be part of this. It's co-sponsoring with Mass Peace Action and Veterans for Peace. Sorry about the glitch during that. My AirPods, whatever. I forgot to take them out. VFP has produced a remarkable document, I think, and it's something that we probably all wish the government would come out with. And I'm proud to, our first three speakers were all members of the committee that produced this document. So I'd first like to introduce Ken Mayers with a little introduction. The Marine Corps paid Ken's way through Princeton as an NROTC scholarship holder. He graduated with a degree in electrical engineering in 1958 and accepted a commission as a regular Marine Corps officer, intending to make the service his career. However, his experience as an instrument of US foreign policy drove him out of the Corps at the end of 1966, when he returned to graduate studies at UC Berkeley, earning a PhD in so-called political science, which, by the way, was the name of the Randy Newman song. In 1986, Ken joined Veterans for Peace. In July 2002, Ken co-founded the Santa Fe chapter of VFP. Ken was a member of the National VFP Board of Directors from 2004 through 2009, and National Treasurer from 2005 through 2009. And he taught me everything I knew. I was treasurer right after him. He was again elected to the board in 2020. Ken Mayers.
Thank you very much, Nate. And it's certainly an honor to be here with the folks from Massachusetts Peace Action and my fellow presenters. I'm going to share my screen and we'll start talking about the VFP Nuclear Posture Review. So why did VFP issue a nuclear posture review? Well, it goes back to our statement of purpose, which has been in effect for, 30 years now? And from the very beginning, one of the key items in the statement of purpose was the elimination of nuclear weapons. Veterans for Peace has a working group called the Nuclear Abolition Working Group, which has as its mission actively pursuing the elimination of nuclear weapons. So what is a nuclear posture review? Well, a nuclear posture review establishes nuclear policy, strategy, capabilities, and force posture for the next 5 to 10 years. The Clinton administration issued the first nuclear posture review in 1994, and every administration since then has issued one early in the course of the administration. So the Biden administration started its work on an NPR a little over half a year ago and is expected to complete it early in 1922. Each of them has had a basically different flavor. Clinton's posture review came, of course, shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, at a time when we all thought we were going to get a peace dividend. Of course, the peace dividend didn't happen. The reduction of nuclear weapons didn't happen at that point. So that was the first of our disappointments. When Bush came along, the world had changed significantly. Of course, we were in the aftermath of the 9/11 disaster. So we were not as focused on nuclear weapons as we had been previously. We certainly didn't drop them, but Bush talked about a new triad, which was a triad based on our military capabilities, augmented by new intelligence capabilities. And of course, for Bush Rumsfeld, that meant the intelligence we could gather from torturing people, but also on improved command communications structures. Obama came to power, and of course, not long after he came to power, gave a moving speech in Prague in which he talked about moving towards the end of the nuclear era. But then the NPR came out, and it called for much needed investments in our aging nuclear structure. In fact, it called for a modernization program that at that point was expected to cost something like $1.5 trillion with a T dollars over the next 3 decades. Trump actually expanded on that modernization program in 2 directions. One was he added launch missiles to the new nuclear submarines that were being planned. And he also called for small nukes, lowering the threshold for nuclear war. The small nukes could be in the net range of 7.5 kilotons, which means they were only a little more than half as powerful as the bombs that leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is an extremely dangerous direction to be going in. Now, Biden's expected to release a nuclear posture review as part of his new strategic plan sometime in the next couple of months. And it's hoped that he may move in a new direction, but we don't expect that, of course. Because in general, nuclear posture reviews have always called for more weapons, more power, more destruction. So Veterans for Peace Nuclear Abolition Working Group decided to preempt the Biden's NPR. In fact, it was my co-presenter, Alice Slater, who said, let's not wait for the administration's NPR to come out. Let's beat them to the punch. And so we started working on our VFP NPR at that point. So what we do in the NPR is we survey the nuclear posture of the other nuclear states, plus Iran, since that is getting a great deal of mind share these days. And then we make recommendations for adjusting the US nuclear posture away from one poised to achieve full spectrum dominance over enemies, real or imagined, to one dedicated to full spectrum cooperation, addressing the real threats to life on this planet. So as we summarize that, we say what we need now is a nuclear posture that enables us to reduce the real risk of nuclear confrontation through accidental launch or miscalculated escalation, to accelerate global reduction and a rapid elimination of nuclear weapons. And at that point, I'd like to turn it over to Alice Slater. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thanks, Ken. I'd like to introduce Alice Slater, who was also one of the co-authors of this document. Alice serves on the board of World Beyond War and is a UN NGO representative of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. She's on the board of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, the Global Council of Abolition 2000, and the Advisory Board of Nuclear Ban US, supporting the mission of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for its work in realizing the successful UN negotiations for a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. As a member of the Lawyers Alliance for Nuclear Arms Control, she traveled to Russia and China on numerous delegations engaged in ending the arms race and banning the bomb. She is a member of the New York City Bar Association and served on the People's Climate Committee NYC, working for 100% green energy by 2030. She's written numerous articles and op-eds with frequent appearances on local and national media. And Alice is a member of the New York City chapter of VFP. Alice.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here, and I think it's wonderful that we're launching this nuclear posture review, correcting our nuclear posture. And I mean, we have to think about the state of nuclear weapons in the world today. There are about 14,000 on the planet, and 13,000 of them are in the US, 13,000 in the US and Russia. And the other 7 nuclear states have 1,000 altogether. So that's England, France, Russia, and China that are members of the Security Council. And then there's India, Pakistan, and North Korea. So that's 8 others. Altogether, there are 9 nuclear weapon states. So what's the story now? We're now in such a nutty time. We have all these nuclear weapons posed on hair trigger alert, ready to go off. And with all these weapons in the US and Russia, it's really up to us and Russia to do this. So in addition to the nuclear umbrella, and we have the nuclear umbrella, which we give our promise to use our nuclear deterrent on behalf of our NATO allies and 3 in the Pacific, Australia, South Korea, and Japan. So we must do something. We have to negotiate on this. And we put forward like immediately steps that we can do is to separate the warheads from the missiles like China does. So we have the slides make me a little crazy, but anyway, not only do we have the nuclear umbrella, but we have the NATO nukes where we keep our nuclear weapons in 5 states in Europe, Italy, Holland, Germany, Belgium, and Turkey. So this is a very threatening condition for Russia. And we've had a very aggressive posture in our history over the years. And it started when we formed the United Nations with Russia to end the scourge of war after we ended World War II and Russia lost 27 million people. And Stalin said to Truman, turn the bomb over to the UN, under UN control, and we said no. So Russia got the bomb and the arms race was on. Then when we finally ended the Cold War and Gorbachev let go of all of Eastern Europe without a shot, he said to Reagan, when they met in Reykjavik, let's get rid of all our nuclear weapons. Reagan said, great ideas, but don't do Star Wars. Well, Reagan said, I can't give up Star Wars. So Gorbachev pulled the offer off the table. Then Clinton comes in and bombs Kosovo, which was against our treaty with the United Nations that we'd never perform a war of aggression unless we were under imminent threat of attack, and they were not going to attack the United States. We bombed them over the Russian veto in the Security Council. And then Clinton was starting to negotiate with Romania to put missiles in there. Putin called him and said, let's cut all our bombs to 1,000 each and call everybody at the table to negotiate a treaty. And Clinton said, I can't give up my missiles and that we're going into Romania. And then Bush comes in, he's president, he walks out of this anti-ballistic missile treaty that we had with Russia since 1972. And then Trump actually started to put them into Poland, so we're expanding. I mean, can you imagine what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis? That's what we're looking at now. I mean, what if they were putting missiles in Canada or Mexico? We went nuts, And it's very interesting, the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Kennedy made a secret deal with Gorbachev when Gorbachev took the missiles out, that we would get our missiles out of Turkey. And the reason nobody knew about it was because Kennedy knew Congress would never agree to a deal where we agreed to give up anything, this American exceptionalism. And a year later, we quietly pulled them back out of Turkey. And now they're back with nuclear weapons in Turkey. So then there were other things. President Obama rejected Putin's offer to ban a treaty to ban cyber war after we boasted with Israel about the Stuxnet virus and we hacked Iran's enrichment facility. Putin called Obama, said, hey, let's negotiate a cyber ban treaty. Obama said no. Then Trump pulled out of the intermediate range force treaty. And so we've never even ratified the Comprehensive Pedestrian Treaty, which Russia did. So where are we now? I mean, there are so many opportunities, and there's, what we're facing, I think, is this Mickey Mac, which Ray McGovern from the CIA calls the military industrial complex, intelligence, media, academic think tank complex, and Americans are not getting the story about what's going on, and we're rushing towards war. So we put out these 16 proposals for correcting our nuclear posture. And when I say we're not getting the story, Russia and China issued a joint statement at the Olympics this last week, where they have about 8 of our points are listed in their statement to correct our nuclear posture. So we put them into 3 categories: unilateral immediate posture changes that we can make, such as no first use and no launch on warning, which China is very sensible. They keep all their bombs separated from their missiles. I mean, if we did that, that would be a genuine no first use and no hair trigger alert. Decommission the silos and eliminate all these anti-ballistic missile systems that we could do immediately. And 2 of those, the decommission the ICBM and eliminate that and other ABM system, are in the Russian and China call. So at the end of this lecture, you're going to have a link to their call, and I recommend that we all read and know what Russia and China are asking for. And then we have negotiations that we should do, like sign and ratify the new treaty. We banned, we have this wonderful new treaty that says nuclear weapons are illegal. Up until now, we had the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which said 5 countries were going to make good faith efforts to give up their nuclear weapons if everybody else didn't get them. That was in 1970. And the 5 were the US, Russia, England, China, and France. And we said we were going to make good faith efforts. That was 1970. Here we are. We have budgeted now like almost $2 trillion for the next 30 years for new bomb factories, airplanes, missiles, submarines. This is like such bad faith. So the countries of the world got disgusted with us. And the last thing, like for a 10-year campaign, by 2017, they negotiated this treaty to ban the bomb the way we've banned chemical and biological weapons. Now nuclear weapons are banned. And we should be signing that because it has a provision for how you can join the treaty, even though you have the weapons, and then set out a timetable with other people. Naturally, not going to do it unilaterally. And we went down from 70,000 nuclear weapons at the height of the Cold War to the current, 14,000. So we know how to do it. We know how to inspect. We know how to verify. The other things we call for were put the ABM treaty back and re-implement the INF treaty. And these are things that China and Russia are calling for, including the space ban and cyber ban treaties. That's in their statement. And then the other thing is get our nuclear weapons out of Europe. I mean, why do we have nuclear weapons in 5 NATO countries? And they're asking for that too. So these are the implementation of treaty obligations. And then there's a wonderful resolution in Congress by Eleanor Holmes Norton asking for, to sign the new treaty and develop economic conversion plans to help people make a transition to constructive employment and a green economy. Windmills, not warheads. So I think I will leave it at that. And that's what our posture review is setting at. And if you have to look at how it compares to what Russia and China. If you think the posture review is off the wall, it's very practical. They're asking for the same thing, and it's up to us to get our government to do it. Thanks.
Thanks, Alice. Now I'd like to introduce a third member of the group that in VFP that came up with this, Gerry Condon. In the Army in 1968, Gerry Condon began speaking out against the Vietnam War and refused orders to deploy to an illegal and immoral war. He was court-martialed and sentenced to 10 years in prison, but escaped from Fort Bragg and fled to Canada and Sweden. For 6 years, he worked with other US deserters and draft resistors in exile, organizing against the Vietnam War. He returned to the US in 1975, campaigning for amnesty for all war resistors and veterans with less than honorable discharges, and the Army dropped his jail sentence. He's been a peace and solidarity activist ever since. In 1983 to 4, Gerry organized the first 2 veterans delegations to revolutionary Nicaragua in opposition to the US Contra War. He helped organize solidarity campaigns to Central America and Cuba. Gerry Condon served on the board of directors of Veterans for Peace from 2012 to 2020, including 3 years as vice president, 2 years as president. For the last 6 years, he served as president of the Golden Rule Committee, which organizes the voyages of the historic Golden Rule anti-nuclear sailboat, a national project of Veterans for Peace. Gerry Condon.
Thank you, Nate. I'm really glad to be here with you all. I'm very proud of Veterans for Peace for putting together this remarkable document, the VFP Nuclear Posture Review. And I want to thank Massachusetts Peace Action for providing us this great opportunity to share it with many people. And I'm glad this session is being recorded. There's a lot of people here, but there's a lot more people who will be seeing it later on. Nuclear war and climate catastrophe are 2 very real looming threats to the continuation of human civilization. Or as Country Joe McDonald sang, whoopee, we all gonna die, unless we can turn things around and soon. First, we must overcome widespread denial about these existential threats. At least climate change is in the news and the subject of much discussion and debate. The threat of nuclear war is not taken so seriously, or maybe people just don't know what the heck we can do about it. It is certainly a miracle that there's been no nuclear war since the US dropped nuclear bombs on the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. There are many documented instances where we came all too close to nuclear annihilation. The proliferation of nuclear weapons and the political instability in our rapidly changing world make the possibility of nuclear war even greater, as demonstrated by the melodramatic US-Russia showdown over Ukraine. The Veterans for Peace Nuclear Posture Review shows that there are clear pathways to nuclear disarmament and peace. But like Bob Dylan sang in The Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, I saw a highway of diamonds with nobody on it. I saw a highway of diamonds with nobody on it. The overall US posture in the world is the biggest problem of all. Like it or not, we are a colossal empire with tentacles and national interests all over the globe. These corporate interests are protected by a network of 800 US military bases in over 80 countries around the world and a huge military budget. The United States is constantly intervening overtly and covertly in the internal affairs of other nations. And you can see on this slide here, this is just page 3 of 50 pages of US interventions. I'm not sure they include the covert interventions. The US is directly violating the Charter of the United Nations with overt and covert interventions. It uses both military force and economic warfare, also known as sanctions, to force other nations to do its will and to overthrow uncooperative governments. US interventionist policies are supported by a hugely profitable weapons industry, the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about, or the Mickey Mat, as Ray McGovern has updated it, military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, and think tanks. The weapons industry, including companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon Technologies, has a vested interest in the continuation of conflict and war, and so they push for it. The mass media, owned by the very same interests, cheerlead us into war with lies and one-sided propaganda, like now. We who care about the future of our precious home on planet Earth, who care about the future of our children and our grandchildren, cannot afford to leave the US nuclear policy up to Pentagon generals, Cold War militarists, war profiteers, and the politicians who are in their grasp. That is why Veterans for Peace has taken it upon ourselves to present our own nuclear posture review, a people's nuclear posture review, if you will. And guess what? We found out that it's not really so complicated. It's not rocket science. If the United States, with the most powerful military in the history of the world, would just take the first steps, we believe that others would follow. What if, for example, the US were to announce that it will unilaterally destroy half of its nuclear weapons, then invite the other nuclear armed nations to do the same, building momentum for the total elimination of all nuclear weapons? What if the US were to implement a policy of no first use and take its missiles off hair trigger alert? What if the US were to acknowledge the will of the peoples of the world and sign the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? That is the kind of leadership that the world wants and badly needs today. Nuclear abolition will be within our grasp once we have a sea change in the thinking of our political leaders. And that will require a massive popular outpouring. The peace movement must become huge and assertive, but we cannot do it alone. We must join with other movements for economic justice, for racial justice, for climate justice, and more. We must build an intersectional movement for peace at home and peace abroad. We must push for the redirecting of funds from the military, from the police, and from nuclear weapons to healthcare, education, housing, and other human rights. Veterans for Peace is making these connections. We have working groups on climate crisis and militarism, on US relations with Russia, with China, with Korea, and more. Our nuclear abolition working group put together this nuclear posture review. Veterans for Peace is also sailing the historic Golden Rule anti-nuclear sailboat, currently in San Diego, but planning to sail all throughout the United States over the next 2 years. We are sailing for a nuclear-free world and a peaceful, sustainable future. We will be taking the Veterans for Peace nuclear posture review with us wherever we go, and we encourage you to do the same. It is a great tool for educating and organizing, which is exactly what we need in the United States at this time. This slide here shows the crew of the veterans, crew of the Golden Rule joining with San Diego Veterans for Peace last Saturday on a protest against war with Russia. And you can see the VFP banner there on the left, no war with Russia, don't risk nuclear war. And I think it's really important that we continue to bring the anti-nuclear message into these protests and call for the elimination of all nuclear weapons from Europe. And here are some suggestions for action from the VFP Nuclear Abolition Working Group. We're encouraging people to download the VFP Nuclear Posture Review, and there's the link, and you'll be receiving it in other ways as well, and I know it's in the chat, to share it widely and to use it as a tool in your own anti-nuclear activities. Send copies to your congressional delegation and request meetings with them on the subject. That could be a very, very powerful action. And you can bring media to that as well. Ask your members of Congress to sponsor the Nuclear Weapons Abolition and Economic Energy Conversion Act, HR 2850, which calls on Congress to immediately cancel the current planned $2 trillion nuclear modernization program and use those funds to prevent catastrophic climate disasters and serve human needs. Support the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons campaigns. Ask your members of Congress to join the parliamentary pledge to support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And also you can enroll your city or state in the ICANN Cities campaign. Many cities and states have already supported the treaty, even including, I think, about 5 states, including California. Writing letters to the editor should never be underestimated as a powerful and free way to reach a lot of people. So Veterans for Peace is as some of our members are doing this already, and we will provide some sample letters for those who wish to see a model letter. And then consider direct nonviolent action against Mickey Matt leaders. Picket the homes of the merchants of death CEOs. These are actions. We had a good session yesterday with our Nuclear Abolition Working Group meeting. Ray McGovern spoke, and that was one of the things he suggested. Why aren't we out there in front of the homes of these war profiteers? We have to take it to them. So these are a number of ideas for your consideration, and it's the kind of thing we need to do to be building a more powerful movement against nuclear weapons in war. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all that you do to make this a just and peaceful world.
Thanks, Gerry. Our last speaker, by the way, please hold your questions for the end. We're gonna have people raise their hand using the raise hand function, which I'll explain how to do later, but rather than put them in the chat. So our next speaker is Joseph Gerson, well known to mass peace action audiences. Joseph is the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, vice president of the International Peace Bureau, co-chair of the Committee for Sane U.S.-China Policy, and co-convener of the International Peace and Planet Network. Joseph is the author of several books about the nuclear issue. His articles have appeared in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Boston Globe, Eurasia Review, Common Dreams, Truth Out, and other publications. He was involved in launching the nuclear weapons freeze movement and is a Vietnam-era draft resistor. He led the successful opposition to the Reagan-Kennedy plan to transform Boston Harbor into a nuclear weapons base, and has since worked closely with peace and nuclear disarmament movements across Asia and Europe. He led international civil society mobilizations for the 2010 and 2015 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review conferences. Joseph.
You're muted.
You're muted, Joseph.
Okay, let me get back to my text. Okay, I want to thank Nate and Gerry Condon for inviting me to join today's webinar. Veterans for Peace's Nuclear Posture Review is an important contribution to U.S. and international campaigning to eliminate the nuclear sword of Damocles, which threatens human survival. Given the many nuclear weapons accidents, mistaken launch orders, and continued preparations and threats to initiate nuclear war, nuclear weapons dangers are anything but abstractions. Like the climate emergency, but more immediately, they pose existential threats to human survival. Hibakusha, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki witness survivors of the first atomic bombings, warned that human beings and nuclear weapons cannot coexist. Given the outsized status of military veterans in our culture, I am encouraged that Veterans for Peace is putting its organizational muscle behind efforts to prevent nuclear war and to eliminate the world's nuclear arsenals. My remarks will be somewhat different. Today, we face what has been described as a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. The Biden administration is again warning that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is imminent, maybe as soon as this coming Wednesday, and has dispatched nuclear-capable B-52 bombers to Britain. We have to hope that Vladimir Putin is honest in saying that he doesn't intend to invade Ukraine. Such an attack would be disastrous for the people of all nations involved. Even if war is avoided, increased Russian, NATO, and Ukrainian military deployments will likely remain essentially and very dangerously unchanged for months or longer, serving as leverage for negotiations over Ukraine's future, its relations with Russia, and for a revised and stable Euro-Atlantic security architecture. Four of the five leading nuclear powers are eyeball to eyeball in confrontation. It is unlikely that the crisis will escalate to nuclear war, but unlikely is not impossible. As former U.S. Ambassador Huntsman, former U.S. Secretary of Energy Moniz, and former Senator Nunn wrote this week, quote, "The risk of an accident, miscalculation, or disastrous decision is especially ominous when the two countries with the largest nuclear weapons arsenals are on opposite sides." It is thus important to remember, as Daniel Ellsberg, who designed U.S. nuclear warfighting doctrines for Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, has taught us, that during numerous international crises and wars, one U.S. president after another has prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war. And every other nuclear power has done so at least once. The year after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Truman successfully threatened to annihilate Moscow to win its almost immediate withdrawal from Iran, and went on to repeatedly threaten nuclear war during the Korean War. Eisenhower offered France nuclear weapons to break the siege at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, ordered a nuclear alert during the CIA's coup to overthrow the Guatemala government, and with his 1953 nuclear threat against Korea, he provided the model for Nixon's madman nuclear threat against Vietnam. Johnson made his threats and preparations for nuclear war during the siege of Khe Sanh and during the 1967 Middle East War. Nixon did so more than once during his Vietnam War, and several times to reinforce U.S. Middle East hegemony. Carter and Reagan threatened the use of all means necessary for the same reason in the wakes of the Iran Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Bush 1, Quayle, Cheney, and Prime Minister Major did it again on the eve of the first Gulf War. Clinton almost stumbled into a nuclear war over Korea, with Jimmy Carter pulling his irons out of the fire. And Clinton also threatened nuclear war against Libya and Iraq. Bush the Lesser did it again on 9/11 and in the run-up to his invasion of Iraq. And Obama put, quote, all options on the table, which would include nuclear attack, as he pressed Iran in the JCPOA negotiations. But we need to know that between accidents and miscalculations, it's increasingly understood that we survive more as a function of luck than wise nuclear policies. And with continuing US and Russian first strike and launch on warning doctrines, as Huntsman, Moniz, and Nunn warn, we should not underestimate how high the stakes are today. Former officials and advisors on all sides warn that with US, NATO, Ukrainian, and Russian forces highly mobilized and in close proximity, there is the danger that a small and localized incident could trigger uncontrolled escalation, like the 1914 shots in Sarajevo that triggered World War I. They are urgent military-to-military dialogue structures and transparent military exercise guidelines to be put in place immediately to avoid catastrophe. Had Veterans for Peace Nuclear Posture Review recommendations been made operational, and had George Kennan and Fiona Hill's warnings about the dangers of expanding NATO to Russia's borders been heeded, and had the Biden administration not ignored Moscow's warnings in response to the buildup of U.S. nuclear forces along Russia's perimeter, we would not be on the brink of war driven by Russia's fears today. Russia's fears? Yes, it's true that with its 2014 seizure of Crimea, which had almost continuously been Russian since 1774, Russia did aggressively violate the 1994 Bucharest Moratorium Memorandum and the UN Charter. The Bucharest Agreement required Moscow and other nations to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity in exchange for Kiev surrendering its nuclear arsenal that the former Soviet Union had left behind. And yes, in response to NATO's overwhelming conventional superiority, Moscow has greatly upgraded its nuclear arsenal, just as other US and other nuclear powers are doing. As much as these are to be opposed, it should be borne in mind that all great powers, including the United States with its Monroe Doctrine, disregard international law on a regular basis as they carve out spheres of influence at the expense of others. But most importantly, there is the legacy of 3 devastating invasions of Russia from the West: Napoleon, the Kaiser, and Hitler, at a cost of tens of millions of Russian lives. These profoundly mark Russian identity, culture, and its foreign and military policies. Several years ago, I hosted and toured 2 courageous Russian dissidents. On the morning of May 9th, when they came down for breakfast, the first thing they did was to exchange lives, celebrating Russia's victory over Nazi Germany in what for them was the Great Patriotic War. So this is not ancient history or simply Putin propaganda. It is vital to Russian memory and its political culture. It's worth noting that in early January, Alexei Gromyko of the Russian Academy of Sciences advised an international nuclear disarmament conference that nuclear dangers, quote, could get worse before it may get better. He focused on Washington's missile deployments in the aftermath of US withdrawal from the INF Treaty. And he said that, quote, in the eyes of Moscow, there is a high probability of a new Euro missile crisis exploding in 2 to 3 years if Russia's proposals for a moratorium are not responded to in a rational way. Nuclear posturing, he said, on all sides, including NATO nuclear sharing, may change for the worse more quickly than if recent Russia's proposals for security guarantees handed over to the US and NATO are not taken seriously. That Euro missile crisis came rather sooner than 2 to 3 years. It lies at the heart of what is termed the Ukraine crisis. But there are other factors too. The debate and struggle within Ukraine over the nation's identity, its culture and political structures, the complex historical ties and tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and the struggle between the great powers for influence in Europe and European debates over European independence and the possibility of the EU becoming yet another superpower. Most critically, we have Biden and Blinken's arrogant insistence on keeping NATO's door open for future membership by Ukraine and Georgia, when French and German opposition makes that impossible. From the Russian perspective, it fears not only the possibility of the US or NATO deploying offensive weapons to that borderland nation, whether or not Ukraine eventually joins NATO. It is about the refusal of the US and NATO to honor their post-Cold War and NATO-Russia Founding Act commitments. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's 1990 Paris Charter, the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, and the OSCE's 1999 European Security Charter committed the US, Russia, and European nations, quote, not to strengthen their security at the expense of the security of other states. With NATO's expansion and massive conventional and high-tech weaponry advancements, while Russia was weak, in the words of Nina Khrushcheva, this proud and corrupt nation, Russia, has been relegated to sit by the toilet. Moscow is using Ukraine's vulnerability as leverage to renegotiate the European security order to ensure that states do not threaten the security of others in pursuit of their own security. That's the principle on which the last Cold War was ended. And of course, in this crisis, Putin is hoping that the outcome will increase his standing. There is one other dangerous nuclear outcome to this crisis. It's encouragement of nuclear weapons proliferation. There is widespread belief that if Ukraine had not surrendered the nuclear weapons it inherited in 1991, Moscow would not have its troops at its doorstep. Iran, South Korea, Japan, and other countries may well be considering what this means for their future security policies. Diplomatic resolution of the current crisis is possible. The roadmap for peaceful resolution of the crisis and an enduring and just security order include building on the Minsk agreements to create a neutral and federated Ukrainian state, despite the opposition of armed and extreme right-wing forces in Ukraine, negotiating an updated intermediate nuclear forces agreement, banning such intermediate range missiles from the Atlantic to the Urals, negotiating a new conventional forces in Europe treaty, and much deeper cuts in US and Russian strategic arsenals in the course of negotiating a successor treaty to New START, as the VFP Nuclear Posture Review urges. Turning to the Biden administration's and VFP's posture reviews, recall that while we didn't underestimate the influence of the military-industrial complex, President Biden's earlier comments supporting a sole-use nuclear doctrine offered us some hope and a vehicle for mobilizing popular pressure for a no first-use doctrine. Unfortunately, and now compounded by the Ukraine-Europe crisis, there will be only minimal changes from Trump's nuclear doctrine. There will be no first use or sole use doctrine. The posture review may move from Trump's language that deterring nuclear attack is not the sole purpose of nuclear weapons to saying that their role is fundamentally to deter the use of other nuclear weapons. But fundamentally is not absolutely. It leaves the US first strike doctrine and that long history of threats in place. The US will stay the course to spend roughly $2 trillion to upgrade its nuclear triad, while some low-hanging fruit from the Trump era may be harvested. These will likely include eliminating destabilizing low-yield nuclear armed sea launch crews and nuclear warheads that are being replaced by other warheads. These incidental modifications will be ballyhooed by our best and brightest in order to camouflage the continuing race to nuclear Armageddon. In these circumstances, Veterans for Peace has given us a really critically important roadmap for the essential changes that we urgently need to support and reduce and eliminate the nuclear dangers. Unilateral steps that the Biden administration can order, including mandating a no first use policy. Nuclear disarmament negotiations, including updating the INF treaty. Winning deep cuts in US and Russian nuclear arsenals, and implementing US treaty obligations, not the least of which is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty's Article 6 requirement to engage in good faith negotiations for the complete elimination of the world's nuclear arsenals. I've thrown a lot at you, but I hope it's helpful. And I look forward to the Q&A session and want to close once again with an appreciation for what Veterans for Peace has given us.
Thank you so much, Joseph. We're going to take questions, but I know some have been put in the chat possibly, but the way we're going to do this is by raising your hand virtually. And the way you do that is under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. There's a raise hand function. And then you can lower your hand the same way. So I will call on people in the order in which they raise their hand and try and direct the question to one of our panelists. So Michael Hoey, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, my question's for Gerry, and it has to do with the way that people were targeted. In the 60s, the American Deserters Congress in Sweden was targeted by the CIA's Project Chaos or Operation Chaos, the international equivalent of the domestic COINTELPRO. I'm wondering if you were targeted by them and if you know of any current ways that people, the dissent, are being targeted by the federal government that would discourage them from participating in any anti-war activities?
I was a member of the American Deserters Committee in Stockholm. Of course, we were targeted, and of course, the entire anti-war movement is targeted then and today in various ways. But I want to keep our focus here on the Veterans for Peace Nuclear Posture Review and nuclear disarmament focus. But thank you for asking the question and raising the concern.
Next question is from John Falchi. Go ahead, unmute yourself. Lower left corner.
Thank you. It looks like the standoff in Ukraine between the United States and Russia is similar to some circumstances like we've experienced in the past. And the U.S. Army War College has tested through their simulation programs a program called GRIT, Graduated Reduction in International Tensions. It's outlined in the book by Osgood, An Alternative to Surrender. It means one of those nations has to take the initiative. Kennedy took that initiative by reducing and eliminating Turkey as a site for our nuclear arms toward Russia. If Khrushchev would then reduce and eliminate the nuclear arms in Cuba. It worked. We should be initiating something similar with Putin today. It parallels what we're asking for in the nuclear posture, and it's something that the United States can very well do.
Is there a question you have here, John, for somebody?
Say that again.
Is there a question that you have for somebody rather than your statement?
Well, we would like our people to respond to that. Do you think this is possible for the United States to change its aggressive posture of sending more troops to Europe, to reducing nuclear armaments by removing them from a certain place, like Estonia or Latvia, wherever we're close to the border of Russia? What do you think about that?
I'll throw this one to Joseph.
So yeah, there's a number of things that not only can be done, but really should be done. I'd say the first would be the arrogance of Biden and Blinken essentially taking us to war to maintain the principle of NATO's open door when there's no chance that Ukraine or Georgia will be admitted to Ukraine. I mean, it's just simply madness. So signaling that the U.S. is quite willing to accept a moratorium, maybe 15 years or more, on new NATO memberships, one that could be extended beyond that period, would be an important next step. The U.S. Being quite clear that it's willing to support negotiations built on the Minsk agreements that would lead to the creation of a neutral and federated Ukrainian state. Neutral would be like Finland, be like Austria, federated in the tradition, say, of Switzerland with its cantons, which would allow for language, religious, and other cultural autonomy for the differing and very divided communities in Ukraine. And I think the other, although it will be difficult, is signaling respect for really the extraordinary high hopes and expectations that immediately followed the end of the Cold War, and a commitment to engage in common security negotiations for the creation of a Euro-Atlantic security system in which no nation sought security at the expense of others. If we don't move in that direction, even short of war in the near term, we're going to have a very dangerous and costly spiraling arms race in what is being codified as a new Cold War.
Okay. Mike and Peggy Squires, you're next. Unmute yourself. Lower left corner.
Blew that. Yeah, that did it.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see the big button that appeared that wiped out the little one. My question, it has to do with some work I did back in the early 80s, working with the Arsenal Exchange model and the Suriname model that were the Department of Defense nuclear exchange models. Both of these models assumed only prompt effects. They didn't go anywhere past the first day's disasters. There's been research in the last decade using climate change models that seem to indicate that even, quote, small nuclear exchanges would have catastrophic effects, including killing 1/3 of the world's population. So I'm wondering, is the Department of Defense's posture statement still using only prompt effects, or have they actually started to use long-term effects? I doubt they are, because if they did, they wouldn't propose the plans that they're proposing. Thank you.
Ken, you want to take that one, or?
Okay. The Department of Defense, I believe, is actually looking at long-term effects, which should support the claim by both US leaders and Russian leaders that nuclear war is not winnable and should never take place. The Department of Defense doesn't want nuclear war to take place. The military-industrial complex wants to keep making money. And that's the reason why this goes on and on. There's a ton of money to be made, new weapons, bigger, faster, stronger, things that can never be used. So that I think that the Department of Defense, the military people at least, are pretty realistic about it. They know that a nuclear war would be disaster. They don't want to fight one, but they do want the toys that would make it possible.
Okay. Pat Scanlon, you are next. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. Yep, I'm unmuted. Hey, thank you for everybody who's participating in this. It's very informative and scary as hell. I have a couple of questions. You mold them all into one. The situation with Europe and the weapons, nuclear weapons in Europe, which was astounding when I saw those numbers. But so I just want to know if there was a possibility of removing weapons from the European theater. What form are those weapons in? Are they in silos? Are they in mobile units? Are they B-52s or a combination of all? Then my next question has to do with two current, one you could call a rogue state in North Korea, and the other with the development of nuclear weapons in Iran. Neither of those were addressed in any length. So if anyone can address those things as well. So
the first one, Ken, did you want to take that one on?
Yeah, I'll just say those are all air bombs. There are roughly 150 US nuclear weapons in those 5 countries, and they're all air bombs to be delivered by bombers.
Okay.
Anybody? Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll talk about Iran and North Korea. Starting with Iran, they have a fatwa from the Ayatollah that they can never make a nuclear weapon. And they were just enriching their uranium, which the Non-Proliferation Treaty that we signed allows everybody to enrich uranium, except the ones that can't do it, like Japan enriches and Brazil enriches, but not Iran. So it's totally, we don't trust them. I don't think they were getting a bomb, and there was never any evidence they had a bomb. They were just enriching their uranium. North Korea, this is such an insane example. We have a truce since 1953, and we have 38,000 troops on their border that do war games with Japan and South Korea. And they got a new president that was as if we had elected Dennis Kucinich in America. South Korea got a new one. And Trump comes in, and he's going to be a big shot and make a deal. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. So he goes over there and he talks to them, and he they're going to sign a treaty and we're going to stop the sanctions. You know, everybody thinks sanctions are nothing. It's not like bombing. Well, we're starving people. We're keeping medicine away from them. We're keeping fuel. It's killing people, these sanctions. So Trump says, all right, I'm going to get my deal. I want to win the Nobel Peace Prize and get rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons. And he goes back, and the Democrats and the Republicans refuse to take 10,000 out of the 38,000 troops back. That was what Trump was promising them. And when we were negotiating the ban treaty, this wonderful new treaty that says nuclear weapons are illegal, you can't have them, you can't use them, you can't threaten to use them, you can't share them, not like the old treaty. There was a vote at the UN General Assembly about whether or not they should set up a special negotiating group to see whether we should go forward with the treaty. And the US said, all the Russia, England, France, and Israel voted no. They didn't want any talks. China, Pakistan, and India abstained. And North Korea voted yes. Did you see this on the front page of the New York Times? I was in the UN when they voted for negotiations for a ban treaty. I mean, they're waving their missiles at us. They want attention, because we're not giving them a peace treaty and we're still sanctioning them and we're still doing war games on their border. So that's that story. That's
Okay.
not where the problem is. The problem, like Lord Kelly, the cartoonist that had the cartoon Pogo, had this line, we met the enemy and he is us. We have to look inside and see how we got to get the grassroots going. We have to get
Okay.
the people going.
Thanks, Alice. Next is Gerald Belsky. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I have several questions which anyone can answer, but I want to commend Alice for referencing the statement, the extraordinary statement by Russia and China, which essentially said the unipolar world is over and we have to establish a multipolar world. And I know Joseph referred to this original OSC document on protecting the security of all. You can't have a security architecture that only protects one side. So my question is, number one, what would you think of establishing, and I think you would probably agree with this, a new security architecture that goes back to, that basically eliminates the whole NATO concept? And this is an idea which Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the Schiller Institute, which I represent, has put on the table. Why don't we sit down with Russia and China and establish the fact that a multipolar world does exist? The unipolar world is not coming back. And therefore, it's in our common interest to develop a new financial and security architecture that benefits all countries. Number two, the question is, those who oppose this would prefer a military confrontation. And the threat this week, perhaps, you've all heard of the threat that there could be an invasion, which Russia has said they don't want. Could Russia be provoked by military action against the Donbass, for example, into a military confrontation? That could be a way to go for a direct military showdown with Russia, a la Cuban Missile Crisis. And finally, you're probably aware of this statement by Hans Christensen of the Federation of American Scientists that the new military doctrine is even worse than the old one, which is the idea that we could fight and win a nuclear war that's prolonged. And this was revealed in the Global Lightning Study exercise that just took place, which he got a copy of the cover page, which showed that there's a new doctrine to use an assortment of weapons, conventional, nuclear, and this is the most frightening thing of all. So my question really is, what do you think of the idea of establishing a new security architecture that would replace the current war policy?
I'm going to give that to Joseph first, and maybe Gerry if he wants to come afterwards.
I have a
So first to say, it isn't going to be easy, but it's possible. And I think really at the root, this is what the current crisis is about. Ukraine provides the wedge for Russia to be demanding it. I don't think an international conference or negotiations are required to declare that we live in a multi-level world. I mean, the reality is China has risen, Russia is there, and in Europe, there's increasing discussions about, not to be supported, about the possible creation of a new and a new European Union superpower. So these all exist. It's interesting. I've been part of a track 2 discussion. It's sort of the, which one of these is not like the others. I'm there. I mean, it includes former high-level U.S. and Russia officials, senior advisors, and so on. And in these discussions, there is an openness, a recognition that there is a need for renegotiating the described as the Euro-Atlantic security order. It isn't going to happen fast. It isn't necessarily going to happen. My expectation, and part of the dangers here, are that all sides will continue to keep their military forces, the mobilized forces, essentially in place to use that as negotiating leverage. My expectation is that it's unlikely anytime in the near term for the newer, for the U.S. to withdraw its forces, for NATO to withdraw its forces from the relatively new nuclear powers. But over time, this might be possible on the basis of some form of reciprocal negotiations. It's not going to be easy. And I think we'll come back to, I think ultimately, is that we need to look at the political forces in our country. We need to recognize that we face the dangers both from those who would really eliminate democracy, or the degree of democracy that we have, constitutional democracy. That's a very real danger. And we wouldn't expect that those bellicose forces to be willing to negotiate a new and more secure global order. And similarly, as we see from Biden and Blinken, so many of the really arrogant and ignorant liberals who simply assume U.S. manifest destiny also are obstacles. So we have very serious work to do, in changing our manifest destiny identity here and that ideology, and it comes back as well to assumptions of white supremacy. So we've got to deal with all of these if we're going to be able to move internationally.
Gerry, did you want to take a little, just briefly?
I think the confrontation over Ukraine is complex and curious and kind of like a Rorschach test, and there's a lot going on that we don't see. I think we hear a lot over and over and over again about 100,000 Russian troops on the border ready to invade. We don't hear so much about the supposed up to 150,000 Ukrainian troops that are on the edge of Donbass, and maybe the Russian troops on the near Ukraine have something to do with responding to a possible Ukrainian attack on the autonomous region of Donbass. When we hear about Biden and others saying that there may be a false flag coming from Russia as an excuse to invade Ukraine, well, I don't think it would be a false flag necessarily. It might be an actual Ukrainian offensive that could potentially draw Russian troops across the border. It appears that there may be some people in the U.S., in and around the U.S. administration, that would love to draw Russia into Ukraine, who really are looking for war. So it is even though I think most of the knowledgeable experts do not believe Russia has any intention of invading Ukraine, we are, it's a very, very dangerous situation, and it could all too easily spark into a real war in Europe.
Alice, hold that. I'm going to move on to the next question. Bruce Burdick, go ahead and unmute yourself. There's a bunch of people with questions.
Yeah, my question is actually it's easiest to understand if you look at the chat at 12:03. I wrote in my question, but I'd like to say it too. For the Veterans for Peace Nuclear Posture Review include the statement that the U.S. and other nuclear powers cannot maintain and upgrade nuclear weapons and uphold their commitment in the Paris Agreement to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. We can know this by describing the CO2 emissions of the ideal mathematically average world citizen on track to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C. You can look at the United Nations Environmental Gap, page 13, gap report, and do some calculations to find out that in 2030, the ideal average citizen is emitting 12.3 or fewer pounds of CO2 per day if they're truly on track to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. That's something our nation needs to do to meet its commitment to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Right now, the average U.S. citizen emits about 98 pounds of CO2.
Bruce, I'm gonna interrupt you, Bruce. So your question is relating nuclear weapons to climate change. Is that correct?
Exactly, that we cannot uphold our agreement to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And
okay. So I'm gonna ask Ken to take that one.
I think what you're saying, Bruce, is important. But in terms of things that the United States needs to do to uphold its commitments in the Paris Agreement and its obligations to humanity, the building of nuclear weapons, frankly, isn't a big chunk of that. I mean, as long as we are driving as much as we do, as much as we are flying, as much as we do, these are big ticket items in terms of global climate change. And I'll just jump ahead a minute and say, with respect to the previous question of a new security agreement, I believe if climate pressures keep growing at the rate they do, they keep exceeding the conservative estimates of the scientists, that I think it won't be too many years before the climate pressures force the powers to recognize the multipolar world and come to a new security arrangements so they can all work together to eliminate the climate crisis.
Thanks, Ken. Sally Alice, I'm gonna unmute yourself and ask your question.
This is addressed to any one of them. I'd like to hear a comment about the sale of the nuclear-armed submarines to Australia with relation to the nuclear posture review.
Okay, who would like to take that one? Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we think it might violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty because we're getting Australia to get to weapons grade nuclear power to power their submarines. So they never had that technology. So we're spreading this nuclear technology was part of the Faustian bargain of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We promised everybody, if you promise not to get nuclear weapons, we'll give you the keys to the bomb factory, like we'll let you have nuclear power. And that's what happened in North Korea. They got their peaceful power, walked out, enriched it some more, made a bomb. And that's what we're going to be doing with Australia. So we should oppose it. And I just want to say that we don't need a new security version in Europe. We have the United Nations. I mean, this is like what Russia and China said in their statement, that they firmly intend to adhere to moral principles and accept their responsibilities, strongly advocate the international system with the central coordinating role of the United Nations in international affairs, defend the world order based on international law, including the purposes and principles of the Charter. We did it. I mean, if we didn't have it, we'd have to invent it again. So I mean, that's what I think.
Joseph, go ahead.
Just to say, with all due respect to Alice, there's words and actions. And I think great powers act like great powers, and it's not nice. So even with the UN Charter, we have, for example, and clearly the U.S. Is trying to maintain its hegemony in the Asia Pacific. But the reality also is that China has now claimed 80% of the South China Sea, has sent as many as 200 ships to intervene within the Philippines. And we do have the Russian seizure of Crimea in 2014 in violation of the UN Charter. So I think while we want to hold and advocate that, I think we have to look more deeply at the nuts and bolts and press for agreements that are going to be actually recognized and implemented.
Okay, John Prane is the next question. Go ahead, John.
Hi. Does the Mickey Mat have a point of vulnerability so that activists could focus on that and try to erode their power?
Who would like to take that one on? Ken, go ahead.
The Mickey Mat's point of vulnerability is that most of the Mickey Mat, excluding the Defense Department itself, are in it for money. And if we withhold support for them, if we go after the banks, for example, that fund the military-industrial complex, that support their price shares and so forth, one point of vulnerability is you go to the banks and withdraw your money from the banks, put them in credit unions, put them in other sources that you can, and little by little, we can do it, and get your municipalities to withdraw their pension funds from the banks that support the Mickey Mat. I think this is probably their greatest point of vulnerability. It isn't a huge vulnerability, but it's one of the few weapons we do have against the Mickey Mat.
Okay. Michael Wong, go ahead with your question.
Yes, my question is about nuclear winter. I've read that it takes only about 100 nuclear bombs of our modern type to actually trigger nuclear winter, which means that if we were to fire that many bombs against anybody, it would be mutual assured destruction right there. And I know that The Code in the Dark was written back in 1984 by Carl Sagan and Paul Ehrlich, and yet I don't hear any talk about it. Among the different nations that have nuclear weapons, they talk about nuclear war and their war plans and all that without any reference to nuclear winter and the fact that it would be mutual assured destruction, even if we just fired at them and nobody fired back. Does anybody know anything about whether there's any awareness among any of the governments with nuclear weapons about nuclear winter, if they've heard any discussion of it?
Sure.
That's a great question. Who'd like to take that one on? I sure haven't heard any talk of nuclear winter. Ken, go ahead.
Well, there again, I don't think there's been any explicit talk about nuclear winter, but I do think that nuclear winter, which actually underlies the statement of the 5 nuclear powers that all agreed to a statement a few weeks ago that nuclear war is unwinnable and cannot be fought. And I think that their appreciation of the danger of nuclear winter is really what motivated them to come together with that statement.
Anybody else want to comment? Okay. Peter, go ahead with your question.
Oh, thanks very much. First off, I must say, I'm very proud of Veterans for Peace. I wish I was a veteran so I could join your organization. My God, what have you've done? Okay, it's just fantastic. Thank you.
We have non-veterans.
You do?
Yes, we do. You can join as an associate member About one fifth of our membership, I believe, are not veterans.
I'll sign up.
Okay,
Oh,
thank you.
all right. So then my question is, I'm a little discouraged by the discussion today because you all seem to think that the current administration, the current Biden administration, is not an administration of good faith. So let me put this to you. There's Alice. I got it right, Alice, huh? Okay. In 2017, in the waning days of his vice presidency, Joe Biden gave a very elaborate, long policy address on nuclear weapons. And everybody remembers the part of it in which he spoke glowingly of sole purpose. And that's given them lots of hopes. But almost nobody remembers at the very end of it, he said, if we want a world without nuclear weapons, the United States must, and he said must, take the initiative to lead us there. And then he went on to say, because we are the only nation to have ever used nuclear weapons, we have a great moral responsibility to lead the charge. Now, taken by themselves, those are fabulous words. So where do you guys come out on whether you think that Joe Biden meant them then, means them now, and could be encouraged to deliver on it?
Okay, thanks, Peter. Alice, go ahead.
Even if he meant them then, the woman that he appointed to do his nuclear posture review, the Defense Department made him back off. She was sort of like, if you could call her a peacenik, but at least she wasn't, a total war hawk. And they took her off the committee with a very weak reason why she was taken off this group to write the nuclear posture. It's not going to happen from Joe Biden. It's not going to happen. It's got to happen from the grassroots. That's what Ray McGovern said to us last night on our call, that, show up at the CEOs' houses. We got to, it's got to come from us, because they're all bought, they're corrupt, they're frightened because there's so much money invested in corruption and war. That's where we are right now. We're in a bad spot.
Anybody else want to take that on? What they think Biden is on this issue?
Oh, I'll just say quickly that there was a lot of hope that that Biden would come in with a new nuclear posture. He was talking about no first use, or at least no sole, or at least sole purpose. But the indications that we've heard so far is that those things are being abandoned, and that we're going to see kind of the same old kind of. The only thing that he may be doing is eliminating some of the new nuclear weapons that were initiated under the Trump administration. But that would be, as someone said, very low-hanging fruit, and not really any strategic change in a very militaristic, aggressive nuclear posture. And Ken has something to say about
Ken,
this.
go ahead.
Yeah, historically, the presidents, we think they have a lot of power, and they are actually at the mercy of other great powers in the administrative structure. You go back to Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. In his initial drafts of his speech, he talked about the military-industrial congressional complex, and he was pressured to remove congressional by congressional leaders. And you take a look at Clinton, he entered office and was really expecting to preside over a peace dividend. Unfortunately, at the beginning of his administration, he got tapped with the don't ask, don't tell. And then the Pentagon just came down on him and wouldn't let him do anything. So that we have this history of Presidents. Obama, he gave that great speech in Prague about leading the way to a non-nuclear war. And he's the one who proposed $1.5 billion modernization of the of the nuclear industry, so that, you know, you can't look to the president to do it unless he's willing to sacrifice his career, his program, the rest of his agenda, everything, because they're going to come at him from every direction. So, as Gerry said, it's got to come from us. As Alice said, it's got to come from us.
Okay.
I just want to get in about Kennedy. Kennedy tried to stop nuclear testing, and they wouldn't let him. They only let him stop it in the atmosphere. It went underground. They never let him stop it. And then he made this incredible peace speech, and the next thing we know, he's dead, you know. And Trump, the broken clock, comes in and wants to declassify the Kennedy Commission report, and they won't let him. It's 50 years old. The Warren Commission, you know, on the Kennedy assassination. You know, I mean, he tried, Kennedy. He really did. And he made that secret deal with Khrushchev to get our stuff out of Turkey. He said, don't tell Congress or else they won't let me do it. That's what our presidents are facing, even if they have all the will and the good-heartedness to do it.
Okay, it's 3:30, but there are still quite a few questions. If everybody's willing, I think we'll keep going for a bit. Is there, okay? Robert Josephs, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Lower left corner, Robert. Where you're muted. Lower left. There you go.
You
are
had
muted,
it for a second there. You had it for a second there. Unmute again.
Lower left corner. Robert, we cannot hear you. You have to unmute yourself. Lower left corner, the little mute button.
Mine's on the top.
Well, assuming he's on a laptop, it's in the lower left corner. All right, we're gonna have to move. We'll move on to the next person. Cheryl, go ahead and unmute your. Oh wait, Robert's got his. Go ahead, Robert.
Okay, sorry for that delay. My computer was not responding. But what I wanted to ask you regarding the possible diffusing of the situation with Ukraine border. I realize that NATO does extensive maneuvers throughout the year. Let's suppose we could suspend those for a certain period of time. That I think that would be helpful in this situation. Maybe there could be commentary on that. And also, I've read on good authority, economist, for example, that as a result of this massive amount of troops on the Ukraine border, that both Finland and Sweden are considering joining NATO. So that would seem to work at odds with what Putin is trying to accomplish. So I'd appreciate your commentary on that.
Joseph, go ahead.
So first say, sure, you know, there's a range of steps that can be taken to kind of signal a desire to defuse the crisis and move to more equal relations. And you know, the United States for a period had agreed with, say, for example, South Korea to halt its most aggressive exercises, really designed for the overthrow of the North Korean government. So that can be done. The other thing people should bear in mind is that with NATO's expansion, you have both U.S. forces and German forces deployed on Russia's border. Think what that means for a country that was invaded twice by Germany, as well as by Napoleon, and has faced the United States. So those are steps that could easily be taken. There's a second part to the question. I'm trying to remember.
I don't remember.
Sweden joining NATO.
Oh yeah, I'm sure what it was. Yes. Simply to say that, you know, there's always the law of unintended consequences, and so as I'm reading from some of my contacts in Europe and hearing from others, one of the unintended consequences of Putin's military buildup and implied threats, indeed, in Finland, while it may not be moving to join NATO, there's much more support for NATO in Finland and in Sweden now. Also, the US is moving to create 8 NATO bases in Norway. There's always responses to actions, and Putin may be willing to pay that price for what he's seeking, but it's not working out perfectly.
Okay, thanks. Bruce, I'm going to skip over you since you had a question already. Maybe you can do it at the end. John Palms, unmute yourself. We can't, John, even though it says you're unmuted, we cannot hear you. So I don't know.
I had a double whammy on there. You got me now. Okay, so the deal is that I really want to get involved in this thing, but I see it so much differently than you folks do, because I see the president as having the authority to refuse to use the bomb as well as to use it. And so, in other words, we have the UN has just now passed the Treaty of Abolition, right? So the next thing that has to happen is somebody has to decide to disarm. Now, it's going to take a long time for that treaty to go through the Congress and then finally get signed by the president. And then even then, somebody has to give the order to disarm. So my question is, why don't we just ask the presidents of the 5 UN permanent members of the Security Council, these people who purport to be family people and people just like you and me, fun-loving guys, show them pictures of Hiroshima and ask them, how could you think to do that again? This is your personal responsibility. You have to tell us what you think. So rather than thinking that the president has no authority, get it into every presidential election and issue that you can think of. We've gone through 3 presidential elections now, 4, it never comes up as an issue because nobody wants to be hurt by it. So all I'm just saying is the treaty gives us a authority or an opportunity to ask all 5, but particularly our president, how can you think to do this again? Who do you care so little about? And how can you use one without hurting yourself? Those are the questions. And we are not talking about disarmament. We're talking about abolition. They're 2 different things. Disarmament takes courage, and it takes, and that's a positive thing. We should be asking our leaders to, why can't we, I'll put it in form of a question, why can't we ask our leaders to display courage, compassion, and trust? Okay, why do we have to think of everything as being a big conspiracy? And you guys are doing it right here, right now. So that's all I got for you for the moment, but I'd like to hear your reactions.
Anybody want to take that one on?
Well, I think that I think our nuclear posture review is essentially asking for that kind of leadership from our president and from our government, and also showing that it's not that complicated. It's not so hard to untangle this mess. It can be untangled, and that our government, which presides over the largest military power in history, is in a position to take the first steps and to have other nuclear armed countries follow, and they should do so. But obviously, as several people have indicated, that's not going to happen without a mass movement that really forces the hand of all our political leaders to stand up and to have the courage and know that they're being backed up by the people to abolish nuclear weapons. So that's what Veterans for Peace wants to see, and we're going to keep on banging on every door that we can to make that happen, including responding to the upcoming nuclear posture review of the Biden administration. It's great that we have ours out first. It's going to be really interesting to compare them side by side. But yes, we need also to make a very human appeal, people to people appeal to around the world and to all of our leaders. So thank you for that.
Okay. Anne Frisch, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I keep looking at these truckers and wishing we had the truckers on our side. But my friends say, oh no, they want a nuclear war. But do we really know that? They seem to be very anti-government. I want my freedom kind of thing. Have we reached out to any of them? Veterans, if anybody ought to be able to reach out to them. Where are some hidden sources of strength?
Is there a question there?
Truckers for Peace, I like it.
Alice.
Yeah, well, the Quincy Foundation, this is a new foundation that's being funded by the right wing to like ratchet down the arms race. No, Ken, aren't they right? Like the Koch brothers and
it's really an interesting mix.
Yeah.
And Quincy is it's a really interesting bunch of people who have very informative dialogues on their
right.
webinars.
But they're not from the usual suspects like us, like the liberal progressives, and they are, talking for arms control and disarmament, and so that's good. So in answer to your question, there is some but people coming up on the right, that might make alliances with us, at least on something like nuclear weapons. I mean, that's really bad for everybody.
There's somebody on the phone who wants to ask a question, so you're going to have to unmute yourself. I think you do it *6 or *9, one of those. There you go.
Hi, can you hear me? Jake is
Yes,
my name, calling from Chicago. This is for Gerry. My question is, I have a question and just a brief comment. My question is, you mentioned some legislation. Could you repeat slowly the name and the number of the bill and who the sponsors are?
Okay, don't have that right in front of me, but it's in the chat, I know.
It's also in the NPR, isn't it?
I believe it's HR 2850, introduced by Eleanor Holmes Norton.
What's
he has
it
introduced this.
2850.
What's it? 2850.
And there are certain members that have signed on. If you go on the
HR 2850.
What's the name of it?
Just Google Eleanor
Economic
Holmes Norton.
and Energy Conversion Act.
Economic
and Energy Conversion Act, and there are members of Congress that have signed on. I asked mine to, and she, you can ask me.
And what is her name?
Eleanor Holmes Norton.
And where is she from?
Washington, D.C. She has no vote.
Oh, Eleanor Holmes Norton. Okay. She has no vote. Norton.
But
She's from D.C.
she can put in legislation. So.
All right.
Yeah, any other co-sponsors?
Yes. Look on the website of the.
Okay.
Yeah, you can find that.
Okay, all right. Got another question for anyone. I'm just gonna throw it out there. Remember the Chernobyl accident in 1986? It turns out that the Chernobyl reactor is a dual-purpose reactor. It was an older reactor, a Soviet-era reactor. It was designed for military purposes. Electricity is just a byproduct. The point is, there are 20 or more such reactors scattered within about 1,000-mile radius within Ukraine. The agreement in 1994, Ukraine was to give possession of the nuclear weapons over to Russia, but I would wonder if the agreement said anything about these dual-purpose reactors. The point is, maybe one of the unstated reasons that Russia is threatening to attack is to take control of these nuclear reactors so that the Ukrainians don't don't stockpile plutonium, which they could later use against Russia. You get my drift?
Yeah. Okay, that's a question. Anybody want to take that? Joseph.
So just to say, I think that's pretty unlikely. But underneath it all, you know, the reality is that every nuclear power plant is a ticking time bomb. So if you're in the middle of a war, you know, the danger of destroying or having a major nuclear accident is vastly increased. So one more reason to do everything we can to prevent a war there.
Thanks, Joseph. We got a question from my buddy, Gene Marks. Unmute yourself, Gene.
Sure. Hey, I would just think that I don't know that this has come up during your, first of all, shout out to the committee for the review. It's great, a great job. I was wondering if the nuclear review has been discussed with some of our international chapters. I mean, we've got a small group of folks from VFP UK that are planning to go over into Russia in May, and I know there's some Asian chapters. It seems like this is something that most of these international chapters should be in the middle of discussing, at least to proliferate the study.
Anybody want to take that? Gerry, you want to take that one?
Sure, that's an excellent idea, Gene. In fact, we discussed that briefly yesterday at our Nuclear Abolition Working Group meeting. It was one of the suggestions that Ray McGovern made for what Veterans for Peace could be doing. We do have these international chapters, including, by the way, a chapter in Russia. So I think we need to start to flex our international global footprint and start actualizing those contacts at this critical moment. So that's a very good idea. Ken,
go ahead.
Yeah, and Rachel Clark has translated it into Japanese and distributed it not only to VFP Japan, but to a great number of folks in the Japanese anti-nuclear movement.
Great, great. Cheryl, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I want to thank you all for a great program. It's one of the best Zooms I've ever seen, and I watch a lot of them. But back to Michael Wong's topic about nuclear winter, I have trouble figuring out how these heads of the big war industries can be okay with a nuclear war, because it seems like the whole establishment is pushing toward a war, like they want one. But I mean, these heads of these war industries, they have families. They must know something about the consequences. And yet, you know, we're in this horrible situation. So my question is, what's up with these people?
Okay. I don't know that we can get inside their heads, but does anyone want to take this one? Ken.
Well, they all believe, they make themselves believe that deterrence can work and that they're all working for deterrence. And they ignore the unfortunately finite probability of an accident touching it all off. So I think that, the power of denial is one of perhaps the only force that's greater than nuclear power.
All right.
They're also captives. They're captives of an out of control, profit-driven system that defies logic.
Okay. Let's see. Bruce, you're back with another question. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, so Ken, thank you for your answer as far as the CO2 emissions of fossil fuel burning being much greater than for maintaining our nuclear weapons. But that does not negate the fact that we cannot limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And maintain our nuclear weapons. So to me, it seems like we've already signed this agreement to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Why don't we use that agreement and that commitment to show we cannot maintain our nuclear weapons because that takes CO2 emissions, and our CO2 emissions to be on track. to
Bruce,
limiting
I'm going to
global
cut you. I'm going to cut you off, Bruce. I think this question was answered by Ken before. Dan Shea, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, I just this morning I was watching a program called 1964 Failsafe, and it seems to be dealing with the very issues that we're talking about right now, where an accident can happen and provoke a nuclear war. It was the same year that Dr. Strangelove came out, and both of those things bring to mind that we, as as veterans, as military people that came from combat and wars and a military complex in many ways, have to be the ones that speak out on these issues, and that there's two names that came up, Stanislaus Petro, who basically had a false warning in the Russian failsafe system, and through his own thoughts said he wasn't going to launch nuclear weapons. There was also Valesky, I don't know how to pronounce the last name, who was a submarine officer, who also had a false warning and refused to launch those. We need to teach our children to think for themselves and not to fall for machinery and for even politicians that are going to rush to war, and to say no. That's why
Dan, do you have a question, Dan? I appreciate
the question
your comments.
well, that was a comment, I admit. The question that I have is, you have this NPR for nuclear weapons. We need a no war with Russia NPR from Veterans for Peace statement, and I'd like to see that happen.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Cheryl Belsky, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, my question is this. We had talked about a new security, the possibility of a new security architecture. Now, I don't know if our panelists are aware of what just occurred. You're seeing in Europe, of course, the splintering of this NATO unity with Macron's visits and diplomacy. But have you heard about the recent statement, I think it just came out recently, of two prominent figures, the former head of the Bank for International Settlements and the former deputy director, calling for France, one is a Frenchman, one is a German, calling for France to leave NATO as de Gaulle did, and to end this drive toward war. So I'll leave it at that.
Joseph, you want to take that one?
Well, only to say France's relationship to NATO has been tricky since the beginning, and one can appreciate that sense of independence from the empire. Of course, it also rests in terms of France's illusions to be a great power still, and to look to create and be in the lead of creating a unified European military. It's like yin and yang. Yes, glad to see that we don't have this unity, that there's pressures within France to avoid war. And at the same time, I think we have to monitor it very closely in terms of what its downsides might be.
Okay. It is almost 4 o'clock, so I think it's probably time to wrap this up.
Nate, let me say one more thing, please.
Go ahead.
Now, this is Peter Metz again. I think your call for grassroots is very, very right. And you'll see in some of the MAPA documents that we're working up, we think that that's absolutely essential. So is the Veterans for Peace. I'm just sitting here thinking, you guys are noble people, and you have much better chance of respect from the country than almost anybody else I can think of who comes at this issue from our side. Are you willing to be out front so the rest of us can rally people around you? I'm thinking, for instance, of my own Pax Christi USA. Pax Christi USA will have its 75th annual meeting in Washington, D.C. in early June. No better time than for us to stage a demonstration. If you folks were to lead it around the White House, displaying the nuclear posture review, other things that we could put together, that's 5 months away from now, or something. I think a lot of people in the United States who are interested in this would follow your lead. How can we help you with that?
Anybody want to take that on? Alice?
I think that in order to get the grassroots going and break through the Mickey mat, we have to get Jane Fonda, we have to get whatever celebrities we know to be waving the posture around. And of course the veterans will go. We want to do that. That's our whole organization, is to Veterans of Peace. So if there's something organized that our presence there will enhance, we'll be there. Gerry, can I speak for you? That's it. But the rest of us have to think about going forth. This is just our little secret. It's not on the front page of the New York Times. The Washington Post hasn't written about it. It's not on CNN. How do we get the media and people to start talking about the alternative nuclear posture, correct our nuclear posture? That's what we need right now. And we have to think about that and brainstorm, and however we can, whoever knows a celebrity that'll take it on, this kind of like nitty gritty to get people going.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up. It's been a really informative, terrific webinar. I want to thank
Nate. Don't forget, we agreed that this was going to stay open for people to have discussion.
Oh, we did.
I'd like to hear.
I'd like to
hear from Ken Mayer, so at least give him the last word on how Veterans for Peace can take a lead in the coming period.
Okay.
Well, I was just going to say, Veterans for Peace historically has been more than willing to participate and in many cases lead in nonviolent direct action. Of course, Veterans for Peace is still predominantly a Vietnam era group of veterans. We need more younger veterans to join us. We're willing to lead. We've got the energy, some of us. I'll be going back to Ireland in April for trial for a nonviolent direct action over there in support of Irish Veterans for Peace. So, Peter, stay in touch on that. As you know, I think the Archbishop of Santa Fe has recently published.
I know all about it, yes.
Yeah, a pastoral letter, and it's gaining traction. And within his archdiocese lie Los Alamos National Laboratories, Sandia National Laboratories, Kirtland Air Force Base, which has the largest repository of nuclear warheads in the country, so that this is a very important step. I hope he'll be going to the Pax Christi and maybe even taking our NPR with us.
We want you there.
All right. Okay. I want to thank Joseph, Alice, Gerry, and Ken. Great job. And Cole, I don't know what your plans are, but I think we've gone over half an hour, and we've still got 87 people here.
Yes.
So,
hardcore is still here, Nate. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't shoo them out of the auditorium,
okay.
for God's sakes.
Okay. Well, I am about to get off, and thanks so much. Thanks to Mass Peace Action, Veterans for Peace, and the nuclear posture review is really a terrific document. So
Yeah.
thanks everybody.
Thank you.
I'll hang out while people leave the auditorium. My brother's still on, so I've got to stay on.
Let's see.
Well, I thought it was great. I mean,
This was fabulous, guys. You did an amazing job. Absolutely amazing. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
who's talking?
That's me.
That's
It's
me.
Peter S. And
Oh.
and we have it, we've got it on tape. So now we have to figure out how to use it. Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you very much. But
John is trying to talk. John, he keeps raising his hand.